When we think about the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD, we usually picture Roman legions at the gates, right? But what if the city's greatest enemy wasn't actually outside the walls, but inside? The historical records tell this absolutely shocking story. The ruin of Jerusalem was sealed not by the Romans, but by a ferocious, self-destructive war from within. So, let's dig into how this tragic history unfolded.
The philosopher Seneca just hits the nail on the head here. This is the key to understanding the entire catastrophe. A unified city, it could have held out for years, but a city fractured and fighting itself, well, it was doomed from the very start. So that really is the central question we're tackling. How did a city facing a massive common enemy turn its weapons on itself? How did the very people who were supposed to protect Jerusalem become the architects of its downfall? It's a pretty chilling story and a powerful lesson in the dangers of extremism and infighting.
Okay, so the path to ruin really starts when these radical zealot factions who'd been fleeing the Roman advance in other parts of the country streamed into the capital. But here's the thing, they didn't come to unify the defense, no. They came to seize control, and they did it by violently overthrowing the city's established leaders. This was the spark that lit the whole fire.
The Zealots, led by a particularly cunning guy named John of Gischala, went straight for the most sacred site in the city, the temple. They seized it and turned it into their own personal fortress, what one historian called a shop of tyranny. I mean, can you imagine? From this holy place, they launched a complete reign of terror on their own people. Now, John, he knew he needed more muscle to really solidify his power. So he cooks up this brilliant and devastating lie. He accuses the respected high priest, a man named Ananus, of treason, of planning to hand the city over to Rome. He then uses this fake news to convince his fellow zealots to call for help from a neighboring people, the Idumeans, and it works. An army of 20,000 men marches on Jerusalem, completely clueless that they're just pawns and a power grab. They actually think they're heroes coming to save the city. And the target of all this was Ananus. And he was no traitor. In fact, he's described as the city's last best hope for any kind of order. He was that moderating voice, a respected leader who was actively trying to rally the regular citizens against the zealots' tyranny. He was pretty much the one man standing between Jerusalem and total chaos.
So when the Idumeans got into the city, they, along with the Zealots, hunted down and murdered Ananus. His death wasn't just another assassination. It was the moment the city's entire civic and moral authority just shattered. With Ananus gone, the Zealots had free reign, and the slaughter of anyone who opposed them began for real. The city's ruin had truly begun.
But did this bloody victory bring any unity to the Zealots? Oh, absolutely not. Instead, the whole movement immediately fractured. The city's defense splintered into 3 competing factions, each led by its own ruthless tyrant. Jerusalem literally became a 3-way war zone. This kind of gives you a picture of the chaos. You had Eleazar holding the high ground of the inner temple. Then below him, you had John of Gischala in the outer temple courts, and controlling most of the actual city was a third tyrant, Simon Bar Giora. They were fighting each other street to street and even inside the temple complex itself, and all of this was happening while the Roman army was gathering just outside the walls. It's insane. And here's where it gets even more tragic. In a move that just shows you how desperate the situation was, the remaining city leaders, they made a fatal miscalculation. They actually invited Simon Bar Giora and his army into Jerusalem to fight John. But the second Simon got inside, he turned on everyone, including the very people who let him in. They had just swapped one tyrant for another, even more destructive one. As horrific as all that constant fighting was, the single most catastrophic act of this civil war was still to come. The factions turned their violence not just on each other, but on the city's very means of survival, its food supply. And this wasn't an accident. It was a deliberate strategy. Their main goal wasn't beating Rome anymore. It was beating their internal rivals. So during raids, John's men would set fire to the granaries and storehouses in Simon's territory. And what did Simon's men do? In retaliation, they did the exact same thing. It was this vicious, senseless cycle of pure destruction. The result, of course, was inevitable. The famine that would later completely devastate Jerusalem during the Roman siege, it wasn't even caused by the Romans. It was a man-made disaster, a direct consequence of this internal war. They literally burned their own future to the ground.
Just stop and think about the scale of this self-sabotage for a second. Historians record that the amount of grain they destroyed, would have been enough to feed the city through a siege lasting for many years. All of it. Gone. Up in smoke. They sealed their own fate long before the first Roman soldier even breached the walls.
So, as this self-inflicted famine started to really bite, the tyranny inside the walls reached a whole new level of cruelty. The factions basically trapped the starving population in a dying city, and they abandoned the most fundamental laws of what it means to be human. Escape became a commodity. If you were wealthy, you could maybe bribe your way out of the city. But if you were poor, any attempt to flee the starvation and violence was considered treason, and the punishment for that? Immediate death. It's just a horrifying picture of inequality in the face of total annihilation.
But the tyrants went even further, dismantling basic human decency. They didn't just kill people trying to escape. They canceled what the historian Josephus called the laws of nature. They made it illegal to bury the dead. The bodies just piled up in the streets. And if you were caught trying to give a loved one a proper burial, you'd be killed on the spot. Jerusalem had become an open-air tomb.
And so, by the time the Roman legions finally mounted their final assault, their job had pretty much been done for them. They weren't facing a united, defiant city. No, they found a population already decimated by starvation, exhausted by civil war, and just completely broken by the cruelty of its own leaders.
And all of this leaves us with a really profound and timeless question, doesn't it? The story of Jerusalem is this tragic reminder that sometimes the most existential threat doesn't come from a foreign army, but from the fanaticism and division that can rot a society from the inside out. It really makes you wonder, what is the greater danger to any cause, any nation, any community? The enemy at the gates or the zealot within?